Well, good morning. Good to see all of you here this morning. And as Chad said, there was very kind words. Thank you very much. We do have this kind of lovely relationship where we encourage and inspire one another, but we also use a lot of humor and sarcasm. So I had a whole list of sarcastic things to say about him, but he just says such nice things about me, I'm going to have to scratch them all out now. And I'll be nice. He is a great man, and just in the same way, there have been some situations I've been through as the pastor of that church, Connect Church in Washington, and I've texted him and I was like, hey, am I completely off base here? You know, I feel like maybe I'm kind of going against the current here. And he's like, no, I think that's God's in that. You keep pushing forward. And it's just so good to have a good friend and another pastor who I can lean into during difficult times. And I'd like to believe that we both inspire one another to be better followers of Christ, better pastors. But earlier this year, he's right, he did book me to come in and speak. He said later in the year we're going to be doing this series on community and neighboring. And just recently, about a month ago, I reconnected and said, hey, you know, I'm looking forward to coming. Just tell me a little bit more about the series, kind of where you're going, what the theme is. He goes, absolutely. He said, so we're kind of, the whole umbrella of the series, we're calling it A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhoods. And we're kind of building it around that whole idea of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, that show we all watched when we were kids. I said, Chad, we've had lunch together many times. Have you ever noticed I speak differently than you? Have you caught that? That's not a Washington thing, okay? We don't all sound like this in Washington. I'm the only guy in Washington who sounds like this. This is an England thing, okay? I grew up in England. You may have watched Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood as a kid. I didn't. No, when you were all watching Mr. Rogers as kids, this is what we were watching as kids in England. The Teletubbies. Very different concept to Mr. Rogers, okay? Now, Chad, you do a series on the Teletubbies, I'm your guy. I can get super creative. We can talk about how to be kind like Tinky Winky and not mean like Dipsy. You know, we can really kind of build on that. But Mr. Rogers, not sure if I can help you on that. Now, the truth is, we did have some American shows in England when I was growing up. I grew up with such great shows as the A-Team, the Dukes of Hazzard, Knight Rider, those classics some of you may remember. Mr. Rogers wasn't around, and I realize that's obviously because Chad's a lot older than I am, so that's how he knew that show. But and there he is, it's back, yeah. But thanks to the movie starring Tom Hanks and his depiction of him in Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, I now have a better understanding of who Mr. Rogers was, what his show was all about, and why, not just then, but even now, people have such high respect for him and his values and the philosophy of that simple kids show, but with such a powerful, important message about loving your neighbor. And I think it's because we've been created by God, and there's something in us, in the way God's created us, that aspires to experience that. So when Mr. Rogers brought this idea in of loving our neighbors and being a positive impact and influence in our neighborhood, something of who God made us resonated with that. It's why when Jesus said the greatest commandment was to love the Lord your God and love others as yourself, it connected with people. Because people would think, yes, that's simple, but so true. I want to live in a world where people love God and love others as themselves. What a great place that would be. You know, I've listened to all the messages in this series up till now online. And maybe you're here for the very first time this morning. You thought, I'm going to check out Richwoods, and you've come for the very first time, and this is the first message you're hearing in this series. I'd encourage you to go online and listen to the other messages leading up to this one. It really has been an incredible message overall. And Chad said in one of his earlier messages, when Jesus said that was the greatest commandment, he wasn't saying it was the only commandment. He was saying it's the greatest because if you choose to love one another, love God and love your neighbor as you love yourself, then all the other commandments, they kind of flow out of that. If you make that the foundation, if you make that the goal, every other commandment flows out of it. And we've been learning over the last few weeks that one of the greatest ways that we, as followers of Jesus, can show love to those around us is if we make a choice to love our neighbors. if we make a choice to love our neighbors, that's our way of showing Jesus to a world outside the walls of this church. So who are our neighbors? That sounds like an owl, didn't I? Who are our neighbors? Well, obviously, there's the folks that live to the left of us, to the right of us, the family that lives across the street, maybe diagonally. I live in a lovely subdivision in Washington, and oftentimes I'll go out for a walk. Sometimes I'll take my daughter with me. We'll walk the dog, and she hates going for walks with me because I want to be a great neighbor in my neighborhood. So I say hi to everyone I see. I wave at cars that drive by. She's like, Dad, not everyone knows you. I'm like, that person just waved. She goes, Dad, they were adjusting their mirror. They weren't waving, but I'm waving back. I just figure they must know me. So I try to be a good neighbor in my neighborhood. But our neighbors are more than just the people we live around, aren't they? They're the people that we work alongside, the people we go to school with and sit next to in the classroom. They're our neighbors. The folks that we sit on the sidelines and watch the games, or in the bleachers, those families we find ourselves doing life with, they're our neighbors. But as we've learned over the last few weeks, it's even more than that. If you were here over the last few weeks, you'll have heard some statistics that the speakers have shared about some things going on in Peoria right now, some of the hurt and the brokenness and the pain of the people of Peoria. Those people struggling, they're our neighbors. They may not look like us. They may not live right next door to us. They may believe different things to us. But they're our neighbors. They are the neighbors that God has called us as followers of Jesus to love. So this morning, as we bring this series to a close, we're going to look at two more passages in the New Testament. Two more passages written by a guy by the name of Paul about neighboring. And I love that Paul, of all people, talks about this idea of how important it is to love your neighbor. Because if you're not familiar with the story of Paul, Paul was a guy who wrote a large part of the New Testament in the Bible. Most of the letters that were written in the New Testament were written by Paul. His backstory is that he wasn't always Paul. He started out as a man named Saul. You can read his story in a book called Acts in the New Testament. And Saul was about the furthest you could get from somebody who'd want to champion the cause of loving your neighbors. He was a pious, religious leader. He despised the followers of Jesus. He made it his mission in life to try and put a stop to them. So much so that he would actually hunt them down, catch them, even have them executed because they were following Jesus. He was a terrible man. And then one day, he has this personal encounter with Jesus. One day on the road, Jesus appears to him, and it transforms his life completely. And this is what I love about the power of Jesus, is if it can change the life of someone like Saul, who then becomes Paul, how much more can he change our lives? What kind of difference can he make in our lives? So you've got this guy, Saul, terrible person, transforms because of an interaction with Jesus. Now Paul is a leader in the New Testament, and in two different instances, he's writing to churches. And you'll see why soon that's important. He's writing to churches about neighboring. Listen to what Paul says. He's writing to Galatians first, Galatians 5:13-14. For you have been called to live in freedom, my brothers and sisters. But don't use your freedom to satisfy your sinful nature. Instead, use your freedom to serve one another in love. For the whole law can be summed up in this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. The whole law, everything we've known as the people of Israel for hundreds of years, everything can be summed up in this one command, and we know this because Jesus himself taught this: love your neighbor as yourself. He writes another letter, Romans 13, verses 8-10. He says, owe nothing to anyone except for your obligation to love one another. If you love your neighbor, you will fulfill the requirements of God's law. For the commandments say you must not commit adultery, you must not murder, you must not steal, you must not covet. These and other such commandments, they are all summed up in this one commandment: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to others. So love fulfills the requirements of God's law. So it's really important what Paul is saying here. But I actually want to step back a little bit and look at who Paul is saying it to. See, these are titled Galatians and Romans. He's not writing to a guy called Roman or a lady called Galatia. He's writing to an entire church. These are churches, brand new churches that are being established across the New Testament world. One of them in Galatia, many of them across the Roman Empire, who as a church collectively are reading these letters from Paul. Because Paul is addressing these letters to the church. And the reason he's writing these letters is because some of these brand new churches, they've just got started. This isn't very long after the death and resurrection of Jesus. He's writing to them because even though they're new churches, they're already starting to fall into some bad habits. They're starting to slip into some tradition, some legalism, some religious practices that were tied to the traditions. And I look and I think, thank goodness we as a church never do that today, right? We never fall into any traditions or religious habits, any legalism, right? We never get stuck thinking that the new worship leader isn't as good as the other worship leader because he doesn't sing the songs we like him to sing. We never get legalistic about what someone should look like when they become a follower of Jesus and upset when they appear to still be doing that one thing that we think is wrong, when we have no idea what God's actually doing in their hearts. We don't ever get upset, do we? When we arrive on a Sunday morning, we discover that someone who's here for the first time clearly had no idea that they're sitting where you normally sit. Come on. This is why I love speaking at another church. I have no idea if you're sat where you're meant to be or not. I go to Connect some mornings, I get up to preach, and the guy who's normally sat here is sat over here. Throws me off completely. Like the whole message, I'm like, dude, what are you doing? What are you sitting over there? It's so easy, isn't it, as a church to get caught up into habits and traditions and legalism. And this is what Paul's addressing with these new churches. So what are the problems specifically that Paul is calling out? Well, you see, these churches were very unique, diverse churches because suddenly everyone could be a follower of Jesus. So you had churches full of Gentiles. These were people who didn't grow up in the Jewish tradition. But you also had Jews who were Jewish in their upbringing, but they understood Jesus to be the Messiah and were now followers of Jesus. So these new churches, they were brand new churches, but very diverse. And as is often the case when you get a diverse group of people, there are some different thoughts over how things should be done. And the Jewish Christians at the time were saying, hey, it's great that you non-Jewish Christians are becoming Christians. We love that. We're on board with that. But now that you are Christians, you also need to start doing some of the things that we've been doing for hundreds of years. Some of those things involve things that they could eat or couldn't eat, so that wasn't too big of a deal. But one of the things that these Jewish Christians were telling the Gentile Christians they needed to do was, well, now that you're a Christian, you men, you need to be circumcised. Yeah. Adult men in a time where there was no anesthesia. So some people weren't too excited about following Jesus. They're like, I was really excited about this message of Jesus, but I'm not so excited about the next part. So Paul addresses this and says, no, you're getting it wrong. You're getting caught up in some of those old practices. And all these Gentiles were like, thank goodness. Galatians 5 verse 1, Paul says, Christ has truly set us free. Now make sure that you stay free. Don't get tied up again in your slavery to the law. You see, especially for these Jewish Christians, they had hundreds of years of law that they were used to. And you need to understand, the law wasn't a bad thing. In the time leading up to Jesus, God put the law into place for a purpose. It was for the people of Israel to understand the difference between good and bad, right and wrong. It was a moral compass for them to live their lives by. But that's the thing. It was a compass. I love this illustration that helps kind of explain how the law must have been to the Jews in the Old Testament. It's this idea that back in the olden days, if you were a sailor and you were heading out on a voyage on a ship, they didn't have modern navigational equipment. So in the olden days, the sailors used what to navigate? The stars, that's right. If I was getting on a ship and I was heading north, I would look for the North Star and we would sail in that direction, knowing that eventually we would arrive at our destination because it was north of where we were. Now, there was no sailor in his right mind who ever expected to arrive at the North Star. They weren't sailing to the North Star, they were using the North Star to navigate the direction in which they were going. The law that God put in place was like the North Star. This is what we navigate towards. This is what we aspire to do. But if any one of us ever thinks we're going to be able to meet every requirement of the law, then we're as crazy as those sailors who thought they'd reach the North Star. It's impossible. We'd have to live perfect lives. We'd have to never do anything wrong. We'd have to make sure we do everything right. And God knew this was impossible for mankind, which is why it was God's plan all along to send the Messiah, to send his son Jesus, to live that perfect life, to die in our place. So that now, you and I and the people of the churches that Paul's writing to, we don't have to be perfect. We just have to trust Jesus. We have to accept Jesus into our lives because he paid the price for us. Now we can have a relationship with God because God, when God looks down at us, he sees Jesus and the sacrifice he made. We're now free, as Paul said, from the slavery of the law. And this is a great thing, but Paul is saying now, at the same time, I don't want you drifting back into the bondage of the law, but let's not throw the law out completely because there's still some important elements in the law that apply to us. And that brings us back to that verse in Galatians. Let's read it again now, understanding the difference between the law and freedom. He says, you've been called to live in freedom, my brothers and sisters, but don't use your freedom to satisfy your sinful nature. Instead, use your freedom to serve one another in love. For the whole law can be summed up in this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. You're free from the law, Paul says, but the law in summation is to love your neighbor as yourself. This is the foundation upon which the entire law stands. It's the heart of Paul's challenge to those churches in Galatia. It's the heart of Paul's challenge to those churches in Rome. And I believe it's the heart of the challenge of this entire series to us here this morning at Richwoods Church in Peoria. This is why I think it's so important for all of us to understand this. And maybe it's why Chad invited me to speak on this subject this morning. Because when it comes to neighboring and loving our community and loving our neighbors, Paul is writing to the church. When Paul is saying you're to love your neighbor as yourself, he's writing to the church. He wants the church in Galatia to be known as a church that loves its neighbor. He doesn't want the church to be known as a group of people, some of whom do really good at loving their neighbors. He wants the entire church to be known as a church that loves its neighbor. Have you ever been here and the speaker has talked on a topic, maybe let's say forgiveness, for example, and it's been a really good message, and there have been some people who have left thinking, man, that was a great message, because if I'm honest, there was somebody who I was still kind of mad at, I've not forgiven them, and if God's forgiven me, I should forgive others, so I'm going to do something about that this week. But you were there and you really racked your mind. You thought, I can't think of anyone right now that I need to forgive. I think I'm okay in that area at the moment. So while it was a good message, that particular message maybe wasn't so much for me. That's okay. That happens. My fear is that in this series on neighboring, some of you here at Richards will think, man, that's a great message. It's not really for me. It's more for the extroverts. The people who are more community-minded, the people who like to get out there and do things. That's not me. I'm more of an inward person. I like to come to church more for me. But Paul wasn't writing with a message to individuals. Paul was writing to the church. This was something for the entire church. And I think as we wrap up this series this morning, this is the message for this church. Not that we leave at the end of this series and hopefully some people become better at loving their neighbors, but that we finish this series and Richwood's church becomes known as being a church that loves its neighbors well. Paul is writing to the church. And that's my prayer this morning, is that Richwood's church grasps this as being, this is for us. Maybe I could shift gears just a little here and tell you some stories from my experience all the way across the river in Washington. Some stories to help you explain what it could look like if the whole church decides to be defined by its commitment to neighboring. You see, we at Connect, we are very intentional at being a church that God has put in Washington to impact its community. We do things outside of the area of Washington, locally, globally, but primarily our focus is on the city of Washington. We believe God's put us there to impact that community. And pretty regularly, I'll hear from people outside of the church, either who attend other churches or who don't go to church at all. And they'll say, yeah, we've heard of Connect. We've heard of what you do in the community. We've heard that you're a church that really cares about this community. We think, man, that's great to hear because that really is our intention and our goal. We're 10 years old as a church, and I would love to tell you that the reason that we've become defined as a church that really wants to impact its community, that will neighbor well, is because of my great leadership and vision. Spoiler alert, it's not. If I'm totally truthful with you, totally transparent, here's what happened. 10 years ago, September of 2013, Connect Church, Casey and I, we planted Connect Church in Washington. Casey grew up in Washington. I didn't. This was our hometown. At the time, we were on staff at a church in Peoria, Riverside Community Church. We loved it. We were enjoying working there, but we were living in Washington. And we would invite our neighbors and our friends who didn't attend church to come with us to church at Riverside. It's a 15-minute drive. They'd say, I don't want to go all that way. All that way? You do that Monday through Friday. You drive every day to work, but on a Sunday, I just want to stay. And I get it. Some of you are like, why would everyone go to Washington? It's miles away. It's like a 3-hour drive. I don't care how pretty the shops are at the square. I don't want to go all the way to Washington. So I remember speaking to John King, my pastor at the time, and he was asking about vision and future, and he said, if you could do anything, and I said, we'd love to start a church in Washington to reach our neighbors and our friends who don't yet know Jesus. Take the church to them. So January of 2013, we left the staff at Riverside, and for 10 months or 9 months through September, we began this kind of launch phase. And to be honest, I was terrified that we'd get to September and we'd have our first service and no one would come. So I decided I need to make sure as many people in Washington know as possible about this church. So something came up in May. We have an event called Good Neighbor Days. It's a big event in the community. There's a carnival and different activities. And I went to the folks that run Good Neighbor Days and I said, hey, we'd love to be a part of Good Neighbor Days. What could we do? And the lady said, well, Thursday night is church night. We have a Christian band that plays, and there's a tent just for the churches. They all have a table each, and they set up some flyers, and you can learn all about the churches. Why don't you set up a table in the church tent? I'm thinking, I've lived here for several years. I've never been in the church tent. I work for a church. I've never been inside the church tent. How are my unchurched neighbors and friends going to find their way to the church tent? So I said, instead of the church tent, could we maybe help you in some way? Like, do you need help serving food in the food tent? She goes, we do. We often have a hard time getting people to say, yeah. And they said, we actually have a hard time finding people to help pick up the trash. Would you be able to help that? I said, yeah, definitely. So that very first year, we got some of our launch team, and we got a bunch of T-shirts printed with Connect Church on the front, and we served food. And we picked up garbage. And people would say to us, who's Connect Church? Well, I'm glad you asked. Because they probably wouldn't have asked us in the church tent. But out there serving them a hamburger, we always say, I'm glad you asked. We're a brand new church that started in September. We joined the homecoming parade that year. The churches hadn't really been in the homecoming parade, but we wanted to be in our community. So by the time we launched in September, lots of people had heard about us. And fortunately, some of them showed up on our very first service. And if I'm completely honest, that was my motivation. If we can do enough in this community, the word will get out and they'll come to connect. But then once we launched, people kind of knew us as that church that does a lot of stuff in the community. So we carried on being that church. And for 10 years, that's kind of how our church has now become defined. 10 years later, we're still that same church, committed to caring for and reaching our neighbors. And what we found is if people are coming to connect for the very first time, and the reason they're coming is they're looking for a church that their number one priority is meeting their needs, helping them grow spiritually fat, where they can sit comfortably and do nothing, they're not going to like it. Because after a while, they're going to hear that we're a church that keeps doing things for our community, that keeps reaching out. Because it's not just the philosophy and a vision of a few people in the church who like the idea of neighboring. It's the whole church. It's our culture as a church. And I believe when Paul was writing to the Christians in Galatia and writing to the Christians in Rome, he wasn't saying, hey, to the few of you who like the idea of neighboring, here's some advice. He was saying, no, as a church in your community, your culture, you should be defined as a place that loves their neighbors. And I know from talking to Chad, that's his vision for Richwoods. That people won't just think of this church as a church that's got some people in who like, that the church as a whole is a church committed to its community and to its neighborhood. Our vision, and I hope it's your vision here at Richwoods too, is to be known in our community as a group of people stood in a circle holding hands because we're so connected with one another at Connect Church. But when you take a closer look at that group, they're stood in a circle holding hands, facing outwards. It's a subtle switch from a group in a circle facing inwards, but that change in posture changes the culture of the church. And I hope and pray that as I'm sharing some of these thoughts this morning, you're thinking, yeah, I want Richwoods to be like that. I want us to be a church that's a neighboring church, or the church that's defined for, is love for the community. Yes, we want to be that. Well, as excited as you are, let me warn you about a couple of things here this morning. There is a few catches to this that we've learned over the last 10 years at Connect. Here they are. I want you to go into this with your eyes wide open. When you commit to being a church that's known for its neighboring, you need to make sacrifices. If you really want to be a church that's known for its neighboring, then as a church, there will be some sacrifices. They won't be easy. For 6 years, Connect had met in Washington Middle School. We loved it. We had a great relationship with the school. We'd go there every Sunday morning about 6 a.m. with a trailer. We'd unload the trailer and we'd set up all of our gear. The auditorium was their gymnasium. The library was the nursery. Some of the band rooms were the preschool rooms. The cafeterias where the K through 5 kids met. We set up dividers and posters and a coffee bar and we set everything up. And then at about 11:30 on Sunday morning, it all went back in the box. We put it all away until the following Sunday. It was hard work. Our goal was to one day have a place of our own. And about 6 years into our journey, a retail space in the middle of town, it was the old Walmart building. For a while, Tractor Supply Company had been in there. They'd moved out, so it was sitting empty, and that became available. It was very much like this, an old retail space, and we purchased that building, 25,000 square feet. We were so excited. The weekend we signed the papers to say the building would be ours, something happened in our community. The only big car dealership in town, one of the biggest in the area, car dealership called Ufferings, caught fire. Some of you might remember it was in the news. The building got pretty destroyed by this fire. Everyone was safe and no one was harmed, but a lot of damage, so much so that they couldn't continue to sell or service cars from this location. This was a Friday, because Casey and I remember we were off that day. We'd been to see a movie. As we were driving back into town, we saw the smoke of the fire trucks. Saturday morning, there's still smoke coming out of the building. Saturday morning, I get a call from the mayor of Washington. He's like, are you free Monday to meet with me and Gary Uftring? We'd love to talk to you a little bit about your building. I had a feeling why he wanted to talk. I knew it was going to be a long time that Uftrings wouldn't be able to sell or service cars in our community. And that Monday morning, in that meeting, they said, would you be willing to push your plans back by a year and let Uftrings use your space for their dealership? And in my head, I thought, no. Do you know how long we've been setting up and tearing down in a middle school? But we were a church that was committed to our community. This was an easy decision for us. We said, absolutely. We love being in a community with you. If this will help you, if this will help dozens of local employees keep their jobs, if this will help you stay in this area instead of going to another area, yes, we would absolutely love to partner with you and help you. I remember the following Sunday having to break the news to our team who were responsible for setting up and tearing down each week. They're the ones who in January were pouring boiling water on the padlocks of the trailer because they were completely frozen. They're the ones who are counting down the days till we can just stop doing this and just come in a building like this and switch the lights on and off when we're ready to go. And I had to tell them, no, it's going to be another year of doing this. It was a tough conversation. But they understood that the sacrifice was worth it. And it was such a great win for us and for Uftrings and for the kingdom of God. We found out that the year that they were with us, they sold more cars than they'd ever sold since opening up as a dealership. They did work in that building because of the insurance money that actually saved us money, tens of thousands of dollars when we moved in. It was such a win, but the biggest win was reminding the community what neighboring really looks like. Not by an individual, but by a whole church. When you commit to being a church that's known for its neighboring, you need to go. You need to be willing to go. When it comes to reaching people, to impacting the world, to effectively loving our neighbors, we're going to have to be the kind of people who are okay going. When it comes to reaching people, every verse I read in the scriptures talks about going. Mark 16:15, and then he told them, go into all the world and preach the good news to everyone. In the Old Testament, Isaiah 6:8, then I heard the Lord asking, whom should I send as a messenger to this people? Who will go for us? And Isaiah said, I will. Here I am. Send me. Verse after verse after verse. Go, go, go. The only verse that says the opposite is, if you build it, they will come. And that's not a verse. Some of you are nodding like, oh yeah, I like that one. No, that's a line from Field of Dreams, okay? It works really well for the guys in Field of Dreams. But there are some people in some churches who believe it is a verse because they're living that way. Hey, we'll build it and they'll come. No, the kingdom of God doesn't work that way. It means we have to be the church when we go out, whether we're at work or at school, when we're sitting on the sidelines watching our kids play soccer. Because it's the only game your kids should be playing is soccer. When you're out hanging with your neighbors and your friends, we're going. We're loving others. We're neighboring. We're not waiting for people to come here so we can love on them. We're going out there to love on them. Imagine the conversation if one day you're out there talking to your friends and the conversation comes up about church and you say, yeah, I go to Richwoods. And your friend says to you, I've heard of Richwoods. Never been to church myself, but man, I just keep hearing about what you guys are doing in this community. How you are neighboring so well, how you are loving this community. That's more than just one person deciding. That's a church culture changing. The last thing is when you commit to being a church that's known for its neighboring, you need to be ready for the mess. You need to be ready for the mess. It's not going to be pretty. It's not going to be clean. Some of you who love coming to church the way it is, and this is my church, and I come from me, and I like it, it's comfortable. If we're going to commit to being a whole church that loves well and neighbors well, things could get messy around here. And you're going to have to be okay with that. The great thing about Planting Connect in 2013 was everyone who came was new. So on that first Sunday, we had people sat there who'd grown up in church all their lives, were strong followers of Jesus, and sat next to them was somebody who'd never been to church before, ever. But they didn't feel any different because everyone was new. And because everyone was new, things were a little bit messy to start with. I remember doing a series early on. It was called Known, and we went through some different people in the Bible and what they were known for, and we kind of told the key story about what they were known for. And the week was Moses, and there were several things that Moses was known for. So I made the mistake of asking the congregation that Sunday, "What do you think Moses was known for?" And someone here shouted out, "Building the ark." I was like, no, that was Noah. But I realized that week I can't ask questions like that anymore. I can't throw out a question because not everybody knows what Moses was known for. He was known for the Ark of the Covenant, which is maybe where that person was going. Things were a little bit messy. I didn't grow up in Washington, so it was easy for me because I didn't know anyone in the community really, but I would have people who grew up in Washington come to me on a Sunday morning and say, "Did you see who was at church today?" I say, "No, that guy. I remember him in high school. He was crazy. He's the last person I expect to see at church." I'm like, "Well, great. I had no idea. I'm glad I didn't." So what we did as a church was we decided to be very clear with our expectations. We told the entire congregation in the lead up to our launch and then post-launch as well, we want to be a church here at Connect. If we're going to neighbor well and love our community, we have to be a church that's intentional in our desire that people who come to Connect feel like they belong, believe, behave. That's going to be our philosophy here at Connect. This will be a place where people can belong, believe, behave. And here's what I mean by that. We want to be a place where anyone could come and feel welcome. Whatever background, whatever has happened in their life up to then, if they've been going to church all their life, if they've never ever been to church, let this be a place where they would feel like they belong. Because we believed that if they would come week after week feeling like they belonged, there would come a time where when they hear more about Jesus and the change he can make in our lives, they'll make a choice to believe. We've seen dozens of people over the years, hundreds of people make that decision. They've been baptized because they've chosen to believe in Jesus. Then, what started to happen is their behavior changes. Because like Saul going to Paul, Jesus has this ability to transform us from the inside out. And when we make a choice to believe, our lives start to change. Our behavior starts to change. Now, we were intentional about these three words because in our experience, many of us in the church had come from churches where they'd done it the other way around. Their goal was behave, believe, belong. Come here, change your behavior, fix that, change that, and if you believe, then you belong. We were doing it the other way around. So it created a little bit of a mess because there were people who didn't believe the same as we did initially, who took a little bit longer. We still have people today who come to Connect who have yet to make a decision to follow Jesus. But they come each week because they feel like this is a place where they're welcomed and they belong, and they are searching. And my prayer is that one day they too will cross that line, accept Jesus, make him their Lord and Savior, that he will change them the way he's changed me and many others. Let me finish with one last story here this morning. One of my favorite Connect stories. So, Casey and I, one of the big motivators in us wanting to start this church in Washington was a lot of our friends and neighbors who didn't attend church, who weren't believers. We would invite them to church. They wouldn't come all the way to Peoria. But when we started this church in Washington, they were very interested. We had one friend, her name was Michelle. And Michelle was a mum whose son played soccer with our son, so we just become great friends with him over the years. And Michelle will tell you, you know, if you asked her if she was a Christian or a churchgoer, she would say, "Yes, I'm Catholic." And what she meant by that was, if I ever go to church, maybe Christmas or Easter, that's where I go. So she wasn't really a practicing Christian, she was Catholic in her tradition. So when it came time for us to launch the church, we gathered this team together, people who we knew at Riverside, who lived in Washington, friends we had in Washington who were churchgoers, but they would travel to a church far away, and they really wanted to be a part of a church in their community, so they got excited about helping us start this brand new church. And Michelle came to us and said, "Hey, could I be on the launch team?" And we said, "Absolutely." And it was brilliant. Because we would sit in some of our launch team meetings and we'd ask questions like, "Hey, if we're going to be a church that reaches people who are unchurched outside of the church, how can we do that best?" And Michelle would say, "Well, I can tell you, because that's me. I'm one of those people." She has some great input. It was Easter before we launched, And the lady who's in charge of our children's program came to me and said, hey, I'm putting together a team because we did an Easter service just for our launch team. She goes, would you be okay if Michelle helps out? I know she's not really made a decision to follow Jesus, but she's a teacher. That's her profession. And I think she'd be really good with the kids. And I can be very clear, about what her roles would be. I was like, absolutely. The week before our Easter service, my wife, Casey, gets a call from Michelle. She's like, I'm on my way home from the children's lady's house. And she was going through the service this Sunday, what we were going to do, the crafts we were going to do. And she showed us this video. It was a little cartoon video, about 5 minutes, about Easter and why Jesus had to die. She goes, I get it. I never knew that. In preparing for her first kids lesson, she heard for the very first time, in clarity, why Jesus had to die. Her life has changed dramatically over the last 10 years. She's been baptized. Her two daughters, her youngest son's involved in our sound at church. He's very, very involved. Her two daughters have been involved in Young Life locally, very involved in youth ministry. Just a great, great Christian family. And it all started because we chose initially, Casey and I, to neighbor this family and the soccer team. But then as a church, we've created this space where we can neighbor and love well. And I believe that as we come to the end of this series, I know this is Chad's desire for Richwoods Church. That you too will be a church that's known in your community for the difference you make here in Peoria. Not just for being a church with a few people who neighbor well, but being a church as a whole that neighbors well. So I pray you don't leave here this morning thinking, oh, that was a good message and that was really applicable to some people I know. But you'll leave thinking, wow, that was a great message for our church. Let's pray. Father, we love you so much this morning. And I just pray for the folks here at Richwoods Church. God, we are so thankful for what you are doing through Connect in Washington. And we love the fact that you've kind of called us to be this church to impact the community, this group of people that are stood in a circle, not facing inwards, but facing outwards. And I pray, Lord, that would be the situation here at Richwoods. And yes, Lord, there will be a cost. There'll be some sacrifices. It'll be messy. It'll require us having that desire and that spirit to go instead of just expecting people to come. But God, it could transform this city. It could transform this community. There may be people who choose to show up on a Sunday morning in years to come because of what they've heard over the last few years about what this church does in this community. And they say, I want to know what it is in that church. What is it about that church that they are so focused on reaching out instead of just on reaching in? Lord, I pray for this great church. I pray for Chad and his family, Lord, for the leaders of this church, Lord, that they will continue to enlarge their vision for Peoria, for the surrounding areas, for what you've called them to do and to be in this community. Pray this in Jesus' name.